Hi, welcome to The Making of Madrid, a podcast about life in Madrid presented by me, Felicity Hughes. I'm a tour guide and writer and author of The Lonely Planet's latest guidebooks to Madrid. So I know a thing or two about the city, whether you're visiting as a tourist or you're new or you're a long-time resident and want to go a bit deeper. This episode, or I should say this series of episodes, is a barrio guide, and I'm dressed up in my artistic finery with my little neck scarf here because today I'm going to do Usera, which is my barrio, and we're just about to have a very exciting open doors festival. So Usera is one of the outlying barrios of Madrid, just outside the M30, which is the M30 ring road, and it's recently become a haven for artists. Of course, along with that brings all the problems of creeping gentrification. We'll get into that, but we'll get into other things like the area's kind of mix of different cultures. It's a really interesting, exciting area. And I did a post about this years ago for Daniel Welsh, whose blog is called the Chorizo Chronicles. And it was really popular, but I think it's time for an update because so much has changed since then. So I'll be dividing this one up into 3 different sections because I think there's so much to say. The first one is going to be about the history of Usera, because of course history is my thing, but we'll be going up into the present day and talking a little bit about the tensions created by gentrification in the area. The second one is all about attractions, festivals, things to do in Usera. So I think you'll enjoy that one. And then the third one is about food, because Usera has lots of people from different cultures and countries living in it, and it's a brilliant place to eat out. The big advantage of being outside the M30, the M30, is that you seem to enter another price zone. So I often go out here and I eat really cheaply, under 10 euros. It's insane. And then when I go into the city centre, I remember that inflation has actually happened and things that should be a lot more expensive. But for the moment, you eat well and cheaply in this area. So foodies love to come here, especially for the Chinese food. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the first part of this series, which is the history of Usera. And this will, as I said, will take you up to the present day, and we'll be talking a little bit about the Puertas Abiertas, the open doors to artist studios, which is a festival organized by Espacio Oculto that's going to be on the 31st of May, which is why I'm putting out this episode just before that, so you'll have a chance to sort of get to know the area a little bit and maybe attend this festival, which is really fantastic. I've been in a previous year and I was amazed at the amount of artists living in the area because, as I said, rents are still accessible here. So a lot of artists, were forced to move out of areas like Lavapiés and are now living in Usera or Carabanchel, which are becoming hotspots for the art community. But we're going to begin by going back, and the history of Usera, of course, is a lot shorter than the history of the rest of Madrid, unless you count going back to prehistoric times. So some of you may know that I'm very good friends with Claire Starkey, and she has a tour of the Manzanares River, which runs alongside Usera. And in her tour, she tells you all about the fact that there used to be woolly mammoths. In fact, I've got a previous podcast with Claire where she's talking about woolly mammoths and the prehistoric history of Usera. So do check that out. That's really, really interesting. Then it sort of goes quiet for a really, really long time because the Romans were out in Carabanchel. They were not in central Madrid, but we don't really have anything like that here. It was just pretty much a rural area outside the city of Madrid until the early 20th century. And the area takes its name from this chap called Marcelo Usera. Now, Marcelo Usera married well and got quite a lot of money and then started buying up land in Usera for construction. Not a huge amount of construction got done, but because he owned all this land and gradually it got developed, if you go around the streets of Usera, a lot of streets have names after the Usera family. So I believe Dolores Barranco is one of those people related to the Usera family. But you also have names that are very religious, like Calle Amor del Dios. But one name that wasn't very religious, and one of the first big construction projects here, was in 1929, and it was the construction of an estate, what they call here a colonia, de salud y ahorro, of health and savings. Funny name for an estate, but it matched the ideals of the Republican government that was in charge at the time. And they began building what they called colonias in areas outside what was then the city of Madrid, which has since expanded, to give working class people a decent standard of living. They were actually very modern for their time, so they were connected up to gas and electricity. They had good sewage. And this was really, really important because slum housing was a problem. And these colonias are actually really beautiful and really, really well made. Usera, of course, very staunchly working class barrio or neighbourhood. And this was one of the reasons why the siege of Madrid took so long, was barrios like, well, the barrios of Usera and Carabanchel. So they both these barrios lie next to each other, and Vallecas as well. So of course, let's not forget Vallecas. Vallecas is sort of to the east of the city, Usera and Carabanchel to the south, side by side alongside the river. When the nationalist forces tried to take Madrid, they initially tried to come through these barrios from the south because it was very difficult to get over the mountains to the north. And so this is their first prong of attack. But the citizens... I apologize, I've got a disgruntled cat on my hands. But as I was saying, the nationalist forces, this was their first prong of attack coming through the south. But most of the citizens of Vallecas, Usera and Carabanchel were, as they are now, working class. And the working class largely fell on the Republican side, and therefore they were very resistant to the nationalist forces trying to break through their streets. And it's a little bit like echoes of Dos de Mayo, because this was when, the 2nd of May, when the citizens of Madrid rose up against the French in a kind of people's revolt. Well, and were sort of outgunned, really. They didn't do too well. But in fact, in the case of the Civil War, when the army tried to come through Usera and Carabanchel and Vallecas, they did very badly. It's really difficult fighting through a city where people can be shooting at you from a window. There, I think in the Colonia de Salud y Ahorro, there are some bullet holes. I haven't seen where they are now, but I do know that they exist. And there's a park out just near my house. called Pralolongo Park, and this used to be a swamp, and they tried to pull sort of tanks through, and the tanks got stuck in the park. And it was an absolute disaster, not to mention the fact that the Manzanares River was a natural barricade. So the Republican forces largely blew up a lot of bridges along the Manzanares. So it was impossible to cross over there, as well as the fact that there's this really hostile citizenship here. So this is what happened. But of course, we all know that Franco was victorious eventually and managed to lay siege to Madrid after a very long siege of about 2 years. And then all of this area, of course, became under Franco's rule. So what happens then is that names begin to change. There's a post in The Making of Madrid about how people who supported the Republican side often called their children things like libertad, liberty, and then after the Civil War were forced to change their names to Maria, which is one of the reasons why there's so many Marias of a particular generation in Spain. The same way the street names all sort of reverted to very Catholic names, and you don't get anything, to do with the Republic. Hence, the Colonia de Salud y Ahorro becomes the Colonia de Moscardó. And Moscardó was a general in Franco's army, a brutal man, but greatly honored, of course, by the Nationalist regime, and he gets a colonia named after him. There was a move under left-wing mayor Manuela Carmena to change the name of Moscardó because it's considered that such names are really offensive to people, and that we ought to have names that are less contentious. But Carmena didn't carry on being in office, and now we have the PP in office, and so the name stays the same. It's a marvelous place nonetheless. It got jazzed up in the 80s where they painted the buildings, these wonderful kind of modern, in these wonderful modern colours, and they added sundials to the facades of the houses. So there's a free route that you can do on a weekend run by the city council called the Ruta de Relojes, and you can go around and see these lovely sundials that are really funky and cool. But all around was still fairly rural just after the Civil War. And our particular area is called now, still Almendrales, after the almond trees, the almendros, that used to be sort of flourishing here. So you had lots and lots of almond trees in the area. Beautiful in springtime because we still have loads of almond trees in the area, and they bloom around the end of March. Absolutely gorgeous. They're very similar in appearance to Japanese cherry blossoms. You have some of them in Retiro, going off on a slight tangent. So they're well worth seeing if you visit the city during that time of year. But soon after the Civil War, the rural communities were completely impoverished. There was lots and lots of poverty in Spain, and many people began to flood into the city. So this is when Madrid's population exploded, but there was nowhere to house these very poor people, and they began to live in chabolas. So you find chabolas all over the city, but particularly in Vallecas, Carabanchel, Usera. And I've got a whole blog post about the shanty towns of Madrid because it's way out of sight, way out of the city centre, but Madrid still has the largest shanty town in Europe. So this huge shanty town is to this day a big bone of contention. Madrid's president has tried to turn the electricity off several times. Well, she has turned the electricity off several times there because there's no housing regulation. And there's a lot of drugs being sold in a particular area of it, not all over it. But it's really inhuman to turn off the electricity because there are kids living out there and everything. But, if you're really interested in this topic, Leah Patton, who writes the Madrid No Frills blog, is very good on this because I first sort of found out about the subject of chabolas from living here, and she took it up and she's written stuff in The Guardian about it. So really do go and check out her work. She's a great journalist. But getting back to these chabolas, they really fought to get services. So it wasn't as nice as the Colonia de Moscardó. There was no rubbish being collected. There was no proper sanitation, no electricity, all these kind of problems. And they fought, and eventually they began to get better services. And eventually the chabolas began to be knocked down in favor of social housing. And that's where I live. The building I'm sitting in right now was constructed on a site that used to be a chabola, and that was demolished. And then this building went up in the 1960s. And I have to say that it's very typical of Franco era estates in that there's a lot of trees, and it's built away from the road. So although the plaza out the back is quite rowdy at night, this is really quiet at night because we're facing out on the other side and we've got trees in front of the building. The building's fairly well constructed. It's a nice place to live, good sense of community. I really, really like it. We've got a community centre right downstairs, just on the plaza itself. Of course, a lot of gypsies did and still do live in chabolas. So these are what Spaniards call gitanos. And Usera has a big gypsy community. They all tend to be centered around one particular area that's quite close to where I live, but it's an area called San Fermin. So it's a little bit further. I'm right by Pradolongo, and it's a little bit further on from there. San Fermin is also where Caja Mágica is, which is the great big stadium they built for the Madrid Open. But we have lots of gypsies living around the area, and sometimes if they pass through here, you can hear them singing on the street. I've got a particular memory of one sunny day looking out my window after hearing a gypsy sing on the street, and the guy who owns the corner shop is a Chinese chap, and he was stood outside kind of nodding and clapping along to the gypsy singing, and I felt that was really 100% Usera, because Usera now is a very multicultural district. So we have a huge Chinese population, and we also have a huge South American population. Lots and lots of people from Bolivia in particular, and Colombia. So in the last episode, I'm going to get into that because this is one of the reasons why Usera is fantastic. There's so many good restaurants around the area. Oh, and I should say there are a few Romanians as well. There's a great Romanian bakery that I'll be talking about too. Getting back to the Chinese, I think this is really interesting because there's something I found out about the Chinese population fairly recently that I didn't know. What I did know was that the majority of them come from an area called Wenzhou in China. But I always imagined that Wenzhou is a province, but I always imagined they came from like a Wenzhou city. But in fact, that's the most recognizable city, so they tell people that. But 8 out of 10 of them come from a place in Spain. 8 out of 10 Chinese come from a fairly small city called Qingqian. And there's a brilliant video on YouTube in Spanish that I'll link to, which is a Spanish guy who lives out in China, and he goes to visit this city with his Chinese wife, and they find like all these people who've lived in Spain, particularly in Madrid, and most probably a lot of them had lived in Usera, because this is the biggest Chinese community in Madrid here. And they're all talking about their wonderful memories of Spain, and there are lots of Spanish tapas bars because people have all these memories of living out here in Madrid. Now, this Chinese community I suppose everybody is different, but you could say they fall a little bit into two camps. So you have lots and lots of shops here that are run by Chinese people for Chinese people. Often you might find that they don't really speak Spanish very well, and they're happy with that. They're sort of here to make a bit of cash and then go back to China. They're working really, really hard. They probably don't have a huge amount of time to sort of integrate into the local culture. But then there are the second generation Chinese as well, who integrate really well, or the first generation Chinese who are keen to integrate and have a bash at everything. So we do have a celebrity here, and his name is Puto Chino Maricon. It's a bit of a joke. It would be offensive if someone was saying it to him, but he's sort of saying it to himself and getting there first with the insults. And he's an electropop artist, very openly gay. I think he's appeared at Pride as an entertainer several times, and he's really fantastic. He has a song that's called "You're Not an Activist, Tú no eres activista," which I love. It's really, really good. So look him up, Puto Chino Maricon. And the whole city now celebrates Usera's Chinese culture because we have a New Year's parade every year during Chinese New Year, and the whole of Usera kind of gets flooded with out of Userians. So people come from the centre for the weekend to watch the parade, and all the restaurants get absolutely jam-packed out. So it's the very worst time to come and try Chinese food, because chances are you won't get into a decent one. But do come and see the parade, because that's a lot of fun. But it's exploded since I lived here. I moved here about 10 years ago. It's really gone from strength to strength. And there's a lot of money being pushed into this. So this is a controversial aspect of it, because the local council want to make Usera into a little bit of an attraction and build a Chinese gate, just like there is in Chinatown in London, and pedestrianize some roads, which aren't actually very practical, to be pedestrianized. So this is a lot of a bone of contention with a lot of people about this. And what many people say is that if you've got all this money to invest, then why not invest it in the infrastructure of Usera itself? Because the things that we really, really lack are schools, leisure centres, medical centres, community centres, all this kind of stuff. We have a big problem with deprived youth, and lots of social issues that really need to be handled. In our community centre, my husband helps run a boxing gym called Guantes Manchados, and that's a way of giving people something to do in the evening. But there really does need to be a lot more investment in the area before it gets gentrified. But of course, everybody gets these sort of pound signs in their eyes when they think about gentrification, and they go straight for the sort of llamativo or attention-grabbing big Chinese gate, without thinking about actually improving the services for people on the ground, which I think is the thing that they ought to be thinking about first. Why all this? So one of the reasons for the gentrification isn't just the Chinese community. It's, of course, the artists, because as rent has been rising and gentrification has been going on in central Madrid, lots of artists are moving out to this area. And as I was saying, the open House of Artists Day is coming up, run by Espacio Oculto, who are a great organization that do a lot about putting back something into the area. So it's a co-working artist studio and cultural space. And they not only organize the Puertas Abiertas, the Open Doors Artists Day, which is on 31st of May, by the way, put that in your calendar, but they do lots of other things for the area. So they're a name to look out for, Espacio Oculto. But now, we're really, really struggling with gentrification. We bought our flat. We bought our flat 12 years ago. The flat downstairs several flats in the building have gone up for sale recently, and the price has more than doubled, which is insane. But we're very, very well connected with the city centre, and as the city centre gets filled up, then people go here. And I heard people talking in the local tobacconists the other day about this, that a big vulture fund has built up a huge building right by Almendrales Metro, and they're going to be renting it out only to tourists. This is a source of great concern because as prices rise, rents go up, and poor people get pushed out. Anyway, that brings my little section about the history of Usera to a close. The next one I'm going to be doing is about things to do if you come and visit Usera. So that brings this episode to a close. Thank you so much for watching. And if you're a fan of the podcast or my YouTube channel, please like and subscribe, leave a review. It really does help. And if you'd like to support my endeavours a little bit more, please go and visit my website, because I've just brought out a book called Quiet Madrid, which is about the hidden spaces and tranquil places in the city centre that you can buy from me, and that goes directly into supporting the podcast. You can also get one of my voice map tours, or you can hire me as a guide to the city. I love taking people out on the streets and showing them around. Anyway, that's about it for now. So thanks so much for watching.